at DEC.
Recording started.
Okay, great. dec.ny.gov. Today on our agenda, we'll have me speaking. I am from the Student Conservation Association. My name is Sarah LaPuma. And then Emily Hauser of the Hudson River National Estuarine Research Reserve will be setting the stage for this webinar today. Then Jennifer Dunn will be speaking on Niagara River Habitat Improvement Projects. We had a bit of a change in panelists because of Tim DePriest was meant to speak today, but he had a change of plans. So we're really glad to have Jennifer Dunn speak. She works for the Department of Environmental Conservation. Then we'll have a discussion and questions for Jennifer and a short poll to make sure that everyone is still engaged. We'll have Brian Majka of GEI Consultants speak about his projects on the Great Lakes. We'll have more discussion and questions, especially for Brian, and then the webinar will end at 3:30 today. The purpose of this series is so that everyone will be aware of the range of options available for nature-based shoreline designs and all of the tools and research that engineers, landscape architects, and government agencies have come up with for these unique designs. And today we're watching October 21st Great Lakes part of this 4-part series. Don't forget to participate in the November 18th part, which will be on Long Island Sound. We'll have a lot of really interesting people talking that day, and then the final one will be on December 16th on armored shorelines, and maybe Emily might even have more after that. And so we'll let Emily speak next.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome all our guests and our speakers, Jennifer Dunn and Brian Majka. I work for the Hudson River National Estuarine Research Reserve. I'm the Estuary Training Program Coordinator, and so I put on training programs related to Hudson River habitats and other Hudson River environmental issues for decision makers. The Research Reserve is located on the estuarine part of the Hudson. The Native American name for the Hudson River is Muhankentuck, which means the river that flows both ways. It is tidal with 4-foot tides from Manhattan all the way up north of Albany, 150 miles. And the Research Reserve sites are spread out along that gradient. You can learn more about our research reserves at these websites. We do research, education, training, and stewardship along in the 4 reserves and along the entire Hudson estuary. Part of the reserve has been engaged in what we call the Hudson River Sustainable Shorelines Project for over 10 years. We've been funded through NOAA's National Estuarine Research Reserve Science Collaborative. Going back for a minute, there are 28 reserves in the country, including 2 in the Great Lakes and more around the whole coast, including Alaska and Puerto Rico. Going back now to the Hudson River Sustainable Shorelines Project, as I said, we are funded by NOAA through the NEAR Science Collaborative and we have researchers from Stevens Institute, a facilitator for Consensus Building Institute, and scientists from Carey Institute, along with many other partners and participants. And we have a large body of work on nature-based shoreline protection at this website. So there's been interest in other areas of the coastal areas of New York State, and which is one of the reasons why we're putting on this workshop to not only to allow our New York State partners learn more, but also the rest of the nation. That's what's so good about webinars is anyone can participate. The coastal areas of New York State include Long Island, the Hudson, and the Great Lakes, and the Great Lakes include the rivers of the St. Lawrence, Niagara, and Buffalo, and the Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. So I just wanted to bring up two things that are specific to the Great Lakes that you might be interested in. The one on the right is a Shorelines workshop that was put on about a year ago, and it was part of the DEC's Great Lakes Watershed Program and New York Sea Grant, among other sponsors, and hopefully Heather's on this call today. But I just want to give a shout out to her and Shannon Doherty and the others that worked on this. And the presentations and videos are available on this URL, and we will be giving you this PowerPoint so you don't have to write this down or anything. And Tim DePriest, who again had a family emergency and couldn't attend, his presentation that he gave last year is on this site. And then recently, I also want to give a shout out to Buffalo Niagara River Keeper because they have put out a very nice brochure that's focused on waterfront property owners and how to put in living shorelines along the Buffalo Niagara River. And you can find that at that URL. And then just again to repeat what we talked about last time is that this is the use of nature-based shoreline protection is really, there's a lot of information out there now and a lot of interest all over the country from everywhere from the Army Corps of Engineers to Restore America's Estuaries. And there's many words that describe these methods. And so some of these are up here, and I just want to say that it's just really important to make sure you kind of define what you're talking about when you yourself are talking about this. For instance, we sometimes use the term ecologically enhanced, and we feel that even if you have a bulkhead, you can add some ecological enhancement to that, but some other people might say that that doesn't fit into their definition. So next, we are going to go to Jennifer's presentation. So welcome, Jennifer. And she is a biologist in Buffalo for the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me and see my screen?
Yes.
Great. I'm going to talk about the Niawanda Park Shoreline Demonstration Project, subtopics, finding a balance between living shorelines and other values. As Emily said, my name is Jennifer Dunn. I am the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation's Great Lakes Programs biologist, and I work on habitat projects and protection, as well as invasive species issues across the Great Lakes watershed in New York. Niawanda Park is a linear-shaped shoreline park located along the south shore of the Niagara River in western New York, just east of Grand Island. It's a very popular park and is visited by over 500,000 people each year. It's managed by the City of Tonawanda, which is a suburb north of the City of Buffalo. The history of this park is rather interesting. It mostly consists of fill that was placed when the section of the Erie Canal that ran through the park was abandoned. Mules used to walk along what is now the park shoreline and bike path, pulling barges through what was canal water, but is now the park lawn. In these pictures, you can see a drawing and an actual photo of the mules pulling the barges. In this current day photo, we would be looking at the towpath and standing in the Erie Canal. The park was completed in the summer of 1964, and the fill and riprap along the shoreline consists of demolished building pieces and construction waste for a total of approximately 100,000 tons of fill. So the whole park is placed on fill. This project was identified as a softer shoreline opportunity area when the City of Tonawanda applied for a permit to perform work on the shoreline. The city wanted to break up the large existing riprap into smaller pieces and remove rebar that was jutting out from the riprap, causing a safety concern. When one of our permitting biologists, and it was actually Tim DePriest who is supposed to speak today, he brought the project to the attention of DEC's Great Lakes programs, and we were able to identify $150,000 in environmental protection funds that were available under the Great Lakes Ecosystem Conservation Program to enhance this planned repair into a more vegetated shoreline, while trying out some hybrid softening methods. Creating softer shorelines fits with several New York State goals, including the Niagara Remedial Action Plan, which is a document that addresses impairments identified in the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement Area of Concern program. Perhaps most importantly of all, the City of Tonawanda was actually interested in trying out a softer shoreline in this area. And under this grant agreement, the city is responsible for handling the design and hiring of a contractor, and DEC's Great Lakes programs offers technical support. The softer shoreline portion of the project was broken down into 3 areas where significant erosion was occurring. On this map, you can see Area 1 and 2 are close to each other, and Area 3 is further north, and they're all contained within Niawanda Park's boundaries on City of Tonawanda property. You can see in these pictures how the river had removed the soil layers from over the fill along the shoreline. In discussions with the City of Tonawanda, their priorities included protecting the bike path from the continuing erosion, maintaining the view of the water from the park, and ensuring that the shoreline was as safe to visitors as possible. Priorities DEC identified were also the control of erosion, controlling and filtering road and other runoff to protect river quality, enhancing shoreline habitat for wildlife, and using the busy park as an educational opportunity for visitors. The basic design we started with was to keep some of the rock, as the city was uncomfortable with removing it entirely, and then placing natural fiber logs nestled behind the rock and backfilling with soil, and then covering the soil with retention fabric. They agreed to add plants that were easily trimmable and wouldn't grow so big and fast that they blocked the view or needed continuous maintenance, as identified in our mowing and trimming plan specified to this project. The plants selected were red osier dogwood, a native shrub noted for providing riparian habitat and berries as a food source for wildlife, and prairie cordgrass, a native grass with rope-like roots that holds shoreline soil in place. One selling point that we found that helped us convince the city to do some plantings was that Canada geese wouldn't be as likely to come up on the shoreline and mess it up with their business. Mm-hmm. Geese are usually afraid of areas they can't see into or beyond. There could be a predator hiding in there. The city didn't want too much maintenance or a fully vegetated shoreline, so we agreed they would only plant the 3 sections identified a couple of slides ago. Lastly, we agreed an educational sign would be installed along the bike path that explained why the 3 areas look different from the rest of the shore, and also the benefits of softer shorelines. Here is an early rendering of the design. It shows the fiber logs with prairie cordgrass planted behind it. And then behind that, between the cordgrass and the bike path, would be the red osier dogwood. Missing in this picture is the stabilizing rock that was left in front of the fiber logs. In meetings with the City of Tonawanda Parks maintenance folks, we established that there would be no mowing in the no-mow zone until the prairie cordgrass had established, and a diagram was given to them. Shrubs were to be trimmed when they reached 4 feet of height. The graffiti-resistant educational sign that was placed along the bike and walking path shows a before and after of one of the sections and explains the benefits of a softer shoreline and ecosystem-based management. For those unfamiliar with ecosystem-based management, it's just a method of restoring and protecting health, function, and resilience of an ecosystem for benefits of people and wildlife. Now I'll show you a series of photos of the softer sections of the park over time, starting with project completion in the summer of 2014. By the numbers, the project used about 400 linear feet of coconut logs, 167 cubic yards of soil backfill, 150 cubic yards of topsoil, 800 square yards of erosion control matting, 480 plugs of prairie cordgrass, and 250 red osier dogwood shrubs. The city had spent, by the end of the project, $101,000 of the available $150,000 towards the softer shoreline enhancement. Here you can see how it looked after the initial installation. The riprap is broken into smaller pieces, followed by natural fiber logs, and then backfilled with soil and planted with prairie cordgrass and dogwood shrubs. And here is just another view of that installation. The educational sign is adjacent to the walking and biking path and includes a step-off platform so folks aren't in the way of the path or trampling the grass in front of the sign. And we couldn't miss the opportunity to put a sign here with a park that sees over 500,000 people each year. By fall 2014, a lot of the regular grasses that had been planted by seed had grown in through the erosion control mats, and the prairie cordgrass and dogwoods were kind of dormant for the year. Get ready for this, because this is coming for us Great Lakes folks. Winter 2014-2015 was brutally cold, if you remember. And you can see here the entire shoreline is iced up, which is really good for protecting the shore and plantings from storm forces that could come through in the winter. So this year we had a really good protective ice layer, or last year. March 2015, we saw a thaw, and we could see a lot of the debris had piled up along the shoreline and on top of some of our cordgrass plantings. We also discovered that just a couple of the coconut logs had been rearranged by Mother Nature. October 2015, we discovered a few dogwoods had perished and realized that over the summer, the park maintenance folks had unfortunately violated the no-mow zone and mowed the cordgrass very low and inhibited its establishment, and some of the plugs were completely dead. These couple of pictures from January 2016, and notice something's missing. This is January in Buffalo. We had no snow. We had a very rare, mild winter, and without the protection of ice, a few more of the logs had dislodged in Area 1. By this summer, some logs were missing, as you can see in the picture on the right, and Area 1 it was the hardest hit. And that section was done while I was away on my honeymoon back in 2014. When I returned and before they installed Area 2 and 3, I suggested they made a change and nestle the rocks flush with the nestle the logs flush with the rocks and soil. In Area 1, where they had not keyed the logs in this way, we saw the most movement and damage over time. And also this year we had a drought, which really didn't help anything grow. So we want to adaptively repair the damaged shoreline areas and replant the prairie cordgrass plugs that had been scalped during mowing. So the current plan is to utilize the remaining money that had not been used out of the original project installation grant for repairs. And as a compromise, the City of Tonawanda is using some of their summer flower budget to replant the grass and also to add dogwoods around the no-mow zone as a physical barrier to mowing. Lessons I learned working on this project with the city is that you should never go on your honeymoon during project construction, or they may install something improperly that was easy to prevent. Ensure that when the entity using grant money puts the project out to bid, they ask for a warranty on construction and plantings to hold the contractors to a standard. And if you have areas that require special treatment, like our no-mow zones, use physical barriers when possible. This could have helped prevent the mowing of the newly established cordgrass, as the city hires students and temps to do a lot of this work, and they were not made aware of the no-mow zone, or they forgot. It's also good to have a plan for potential repairs ahead of time during planning, so that should a repair be required, you have options already established. And lastly, be ready for stakeholders and users of a park or public space to add their own design elements to your project. This guy we nicknamed Woody. He's a log that became stuck in the riprap that someone drew a face on. And every time I visited the project site around a new holiday, he was always dressed for the occasion. Here for Christmas, and then he got a nice Valentine's Day scarf and waxed lips and heart glasses. And then he was very patriotic for July, and by August he was ready for a luau. Well, thank you everyone for listening. There is time for some questions, I think, and if you want any further information about DEC's Great Lakes programs or the Niawanda Park project, feel free to reach out to me using any of these methods.
Thank you so much, Jen. That was a really great presentation. I learned a lot. For everybody in the audience, if you go back from full screen, if you're on full screen, you can go to on the top right, there is the chat function, and you can ask your questions to all panelists. I would go with all panelists, ask a question, and for Jennifer, but I have a question that I was thinking of. Is that okay, Jen?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So how would you suggest talking to park maintenance about not mowing down plantings? Because I think I see that a lot where the ideas of what a shoreline should look like are not there. Not everyone has the same idea, or maybe the park folks are told to just mow down all the grass, so they mow down everything as though it was weeds. So how did you go about doing that?
Well, it's really tricky. Even coming to agreement with the mayor and the city engineer, the parks maintenance folks were the most against the plantings, not only for the maintenance, but because they say that people come up to them and say, get rid of this vegetation, get rid of these trees. So that's why I kind of suggested the physical barriers. If we would have made a nice U shape of the shrubs around the prairie cordgrass, they wouldn't be able to drive those lawnmowers into the cordgrass. And if it wasn't shrubs, maybe stakes or flags, but something on site other than just a verbal agreement or written plan, because those just get lost as they get passed down the line to folks that are actually doing the work.
Right. We have one question now from the audience, from Michael Polick. Why was the project limited to the 3 areas and not the entire park shoreline?
Sure, that's a great question, and we did want to do the entire shoreline. However, the city did not. So it being their property, we can't force anything with these grant programs. We can just try to work with what folks want to do and encourage them. So we were limited to the 3 areas that had the most significant erosion and required the most fill.
Mm-hmm. And was it just grass before that was there? When you see all that, that undercutting of the bank?
Yes, it used to be just grass.
Okay. Does anyone in our audience have any questions? Emily? Because we do have another question now from Michael again. Did the city express why they didn't want the entire shoreline? Maybe you already answered that. Go ahead.
Oh, no, it's fine. They were concerned about pushback from visitors of the park, thinking there'd be a view blocked or they wouldn't have water access. And we do run into this mentality along a lot of waterfront. Folks want to be able to just look up and see water. They don't want to have shrubs in the way or grasses. Mm-hmm. So they thought if they did some patches like this, the pushback and resistance wouldn't be as strong.
Right, right. Is there a lot of shoreline, like recreation and use of the shoreline to go into the water?
Well, there isn't supposed to be, but folks are always climbing all over these rocks and fishing from the rocks, which is one of the reasons the city was applying to do work in the first place. They wanted to get rid of the rebar that was dangerous for people and the large gaps in the rocks.
Mm-hmm. I have a few more questions from the audience. David Barnett, hi Dave. He asked, the presentation made clear the value of the project to protect the physical integrity of the shoreline, especially in a public park. Are there thoughts about doing monitoring to evaluate this type of work for its habitat value?
That has been tossed around passively. I thought about doing some amphibian or bird monitoring, but when it comes down to it, the times where people are going to be in the park, we're probably not going to see a lot of wildlife, was the thought. I could see it attracting species during migration or for refuge during storms, but when you have a park with 1,000 people walking back and forth, it would probably be intimidating to the wildlife.
Mm. Okay.
Except Canada geese for some reason.
Except for Canada geese. And I guess for the habitat value of the turtles and frogs and things that wouldn't quite be as afraid of human activity, I'm just thinking that that would be a possible, like...
Oh, yeah, and I would expect to see them there, except for the placement of the riprap is kind of difficult for them to navigate, and the city wasn't budging on that, so we really couldn't do much with that riprap that they wanted in front.
Right. Emily Sheridan has a question. Why was more diverse vegetation not considered to provide diverse habitat and resilience?
That's a very good question, and we did throw out a bunch of potential species, and the city kind of said, we just want two things that require similar treatment. It came down to a maintenance issue, and they had concerns about, you know, trimming this tree once every 2 years or this one every half a year versus having a plan where everything was treated similarly.
Okay. Emily, did you have questions?
Yeah, hi, this is Emily Hauser. I have two questions. One is, I noticed that you talked about that the ice actually protects the shoreline. So my question there is, that seems to imply that there's not a lot of change in elevation of the water because, for instance, in the Hudson, we have tides of 4 feet every day. So even though the ice is there, it actually kind of moves up and down and grates along the shoreline. And so could you talk about the difference between the, you know, our tidal river and our estuary and something like, and the river that you have where there may not be that much change in water elevation?
Yeah, and ice is kind of a funny thing. In the right form, it is protective, but in the wrong form, just like you said, it can come and just grate along the edge of that shoreline. When we had our really cold winter, it was in the 20s almost every day for, I don't know, 2 months. So that ice didn't budge. It just held solid, didn't move. Any storms or water that would come up was just kind of rolling off this ice. But if we had a more variable water level, I guess that could be an issue with Niagara River, but I'm not super familiar with what the difference would be.
Okay, thank you. And then I know that people are always interested in where you obtained the native plants. Do you know the nursery or anything that you were able to get that Tonawanda got the plants from?
I'd have to email you that information. I don't have it on me right now.
Thank you.
Okay, any more questions? I don't see any more from our attendees. But now Brian has the ball, or no, you brought up Brian. Okay. We'll hold up just a second before starting Brian's PowerPoint because we're going to give you a fun poll. No. So the poll is just to make sure that everyone is paying attention and also to get some information like this one. Oh, and let me bring up the question first. You can already see the poll question, and I see a lot of people are already answering it. It is, how many people are watching with you? A, just me, B, one other, C, 3 to 10 in our group, or D, more than 10 in our group. So we have 4 in our group, and we will soon be closing the poll, so make sure you answer. We need this information so we know how many people are watching, because right now it says 93, but maybe there's a bunch of people watching along with you and we have no way of seeing that. So let's see. I see 9 people have not started yet. Oh, they're paying attention. And now 6 people, and give you a few more seconds. And I think we're good. It looks like 50 people said that just you are watching in your room. 4 people said one other are watching. 6 said 3 to 10. And 0 said more than 10. 9 have no answer. So for everyone who has more than one person in their group, make sure to email me the people that were in your group so we can take account of everyone who got to watch. Okay, thank you. And then, it's waiting again. 10, 9, counting down. And I'm just going to ask one other question before we start Brian Micah's presentation. How is our pace? Please rate the pace as frustratingly slow, slow, just right, fast, or frustratingly fast. Oh, wait. Oh, this one finished faster. 15 more seconds. 3 people. 169. Well, it looks like no one said frustratingly slow. Some people said slow. Most people, 82%, said just right. 1 person said fast. And no one said frustratingly fast. So now we're going to go on to Brian. Oh, someone asks one more question for Jen, actually. Brian Hinterberger says, it seems that much of the negotiation that occurs during design focuses on the level of tow protection that is required, or lack thereof. How was size, quantity, configuration of riprap determined, and was there disagreement?
That's another good question, and with the kind of grant we used, that was under the determination of the city engineer and their contractor, and I'm unsure of the analysis that they put behind the size, but it did go through review with our permits division.
Jennifer, do you have the design documents that specified that kind of size, or?
They're held in our division of permits.
Okay. All right, Nick. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you everyone, and thank you, Jen. Now we'll go on to Ryan's presentation.
Thank you, Emily and Sarah and Jen. And I'll definitely start out by saying it's refreshing and comforting and a little bit encouraging and a little bit discouraging that I've run into all of the same problems that Jen has throughout the course of working on a lot of these shoreline projects, all of those except for the honeymoon. I've never had a during a honeymoon, but everything else that Jen has described, I've definitely experienced myself. So you definitely start to see a lot of commonalities and design challenges across a lot of these projects. So my name is Brian Micah. I am a restoration ecologist in private practice. What that means in practicality is that the engineers think that I think too much like a biologist, and the biologists think that I think too much like an engineer. So I tend to walk the line between ecology and engineering, specifically as it relates to natural shoreline projects. So we actually have people on the call from Connecticut all the way to Alaska. So I thought that I would start out by just introducing a few Great Lakes facts and give a bit of a Great Lakes overview before I jumped into a few case studies on specific projects. The Great Lakes are actually formally called the Laurentian Great Lakes, and they hold 95% of the U.S. surface freshwater supply and 18% of the world's total supply. There are approximately 35 to 40 million people that live in the Great Lakes Basin. The Great Lakes have just over 10,000 miles of shoreline. There's so much water in Lake Superior alone that Lake Superior, if drained, could cover North and South America in 1 foot of water. And the state of Michigan alone has more miles of shoreline than any other state but Alaska. Over time, the Great Lakes have lost between 30 and 50% of their coastal wetlands, and that's prior to European settlement. And believe it or not, people do surf the Great Lakes. In fact, I know that some people have been out just this week out on Lake Michigan, surfing the Great Lakes. So these are not small inland waters by any means. In fact, many of us affectionately call them the inland seas. So just to orient yourself a little bit, this is another thing that I find that a lot of people don't realize is that all the Great Lakes are connected and they actually flow into each other. So Lake Superior from the north flows down through the St. Mary's River and into Lake Huron, where Lake Michigan and Lake Huron meet up together. From there, Lake Huron flows through the St. Clair River into Lake St. Clair, then down through the Detroit River past Detroit and into Lake Erie. From there, the Great Lakes flow over Niagara Falls and through the Niagara River, over Niagara Falls and into Lake Ontario before eventually making its way to the St. Lawrence River out into the Atlantic Ocean. So within the Great Lakes, typically our term living shoreline is synonymous with the term coastal wetlands. And our coastal wetlands are important enough to us that a binational committee was actually formed and study was completed, largely led by Denny Albert and Doug Wilcox, to actually classify our coastal wetlands. And there's a fairly extensive amount of work that's been done. But what they really arrived at is that we have three major classifications of coastal wetlands or living shorelines within the Great Lakes. Those fall into lacustrine, which are our open systems. riverine, which include our connecting waters and drowned river mouths, or what we also call our lacustrine estuaries, as well as barrier protected. So here's what some of these may look like. This is the mouth of the Grand River. As many of our larger rivers come close to the Great Lakes, they start to spread out, fan out, become braided systems, and actually do act as estuaries, or in some cases they actually even become bayous. We also have these open lacustrine wetlands. These wetlands typically occur in less developed areas where we've had less of an impact on the shoreline, but we do have wetland vegetation in some places that's able to extend out into the open shore. And actually don't have a picture of our barrier protected wetlands. Those are actually fairly rare. There aren't a lot of them out there, and it's actually pretty difficult to come up with pictures of those for a lot of different reasons that I won't get into right now. So within those major hydrogeomorphic classifications of the Great Lakes coastal wetlands, we have several different plant communities. And what you see is that these tend to be fairly common as you go north, south, and east, west, really across a lot of our wetland systems throughout the United States. Starting at the deeper end, we have floating leaved and submergent plant communities. Moving upland, we have emergent plant communities into meadow or wet meadow, on up into scrub shrub, and oftentimes wet meadow and scrub shrub are totally integrated with each other. And then as you move further upland, you get into forested wetlands before entering into upland systems. One thing you'll notice on the lower and left end of this graphic is within the Great Lakes, there's a fairly significant difference between our water levels. And I'll talk a lot more about that in just a minute. So when we discuss the need for restoration of our living shorelines, we first need to really look at what our major forces and stressors are. And these are generally lumped into two major categories. The first being some combination of erosion and accretion. And that may come through waves, through wind-driven storms, boats, as well as fluctuating water levels. Can also include ice scour, which Jen just described a bit, or we also have longshore drift and sediment transport, which picks up and carries sand and sediment along our shoreline. In addition to erosion and accretion, we also have biological, chemical, and cultural forces and stressors. The Great Lakes are historically known for their industrial legacy, so along with that has come issues such as contamination, dredging, fill, and a significant amount of nutrients and turbidity. And the final major stressor on our shorelines, which is one that pretty much everybody across the country deals with in some way, shape, or form at this point, are invasive species. So one thing that really makes the Great Lakes unique as opposed to the marine environments, in addition to just the lack of salt in our water, is the greatly fluctuating water levels. So here we have a graphic showing, going back to 1920, showing water level fluctuations of each of the four, really the 5 Great Lakes. Lake Michigan and Lake Huron actually exist at the same elevation. And you can see, depending on the Great Lake, we tend to have long-term hydrologic fluctuations in the order of 3 to 6 feet. So these aren't just short-term seasonal annual fluctuations where our lakes are high in the spring and low in the summer. What we actually see is the Great Lakes tend to rise and stay high for a number of years, and then we'll drop and stay low for a number of years. And when you compare that to areas like the Marine Coast, down below we show Key West and Seattle, you can see people on the oceans are concerned with inches of sea level rise, whereas in the Great Lakes, we've become fairly used to dealing with water level fluctuations in the order of feet that may last years. And you can just imagine the amount of challenges that presents from a design perspective. One of the questions I hear people say often is, well, do you have tides in the Great Lakes? And we don't have tides, but what I like to think of as a Great Lakes tide is a phenomenon that we call a seiche. And the seiche is most pronounced really in Lake Erie because of its east-west orientation, as well as the fact that it's fairly shallow. But what happens with the seiche is we either have a significant difference in atmospheric pressure from the east side to the west side of a water body, or a significant wind. And what that can do is actually push that water either east or west, so that in this case, in this graphic, water levels in Toledo may rise as high as 10 to 15 feet, while on the Buffalo side, those water levels may drop as much as 10 to 15 feet during a seiche event. And that may happen actually over a course of a 24-hour period. So these can be very extreme events, but they are typically very short-lived and last no more than just a couple of days. So one thing you'll find as you listen to a number of different webinars in this series, as well as Jen's talk and some of the case studies that I'm talk about in a minute here, is that a lot of the techniques that people wind up using use a lot of the same types of materials, just kind of reconfigured in a lot of different ways. So some of the issues that we look at include things like sloping or making slopes gentler, roughening the surface through the use of rocks or wood or landforms, putting in physical breakwaters such as sills, breakwaters, groins, jetties, and dikes, using all different engineered materials that are available between coconut, straw, wood fiber. One thing you see is common in just about every one of these types of projects is the use of native vegetation, be it submergent, emergent, shrubs, or in some cases trees. And then there are also social and cultural changes to be considered. So now, moving from that overview, I'm actually going to present 3 different case studies, projects that are very similar, but show some different or I should say not very similar, very different in a lot of different ways, but demonstrate some of the different challenges and some of the different techniques that we're able to use to restore a lot of our shorelines. So the first project I'm going to show is Center Point Bay Marina. Project partners on this include NOAA, the Great Lakes Commission, and the West Michigan Shoreline Regional Development Commission. Center Point Bay Marina is located in Muskegon Lake, which is an area of concern, and areas of concern are federally designated by the EPA as priorities for cleanup and ecological restoration. So the Center Point Bay Marina project is located on a very unnatural landform right in the middle of Muskegon Lake. And Muskegon Lake is what we call a drowned river mouth or lacustrine estuary. At this particular site, we had about a 2-mile fetch across the shoreline. At the site, during winter events, we see up to 3-foot thick ice sheets. We had seen about approximately 3-foot-high waves recorded at the shoreline over time. And because of the location of this site, it typically got, and still gets, ice pushed from multiple directions. The project was constructed in 2010, and we restored approximately 3,727 linear feet of shoreline at a cost of about $822,000, which, when all was said and done, worked out to about $220 per linear foot. So here's just a little closer shot of that site, and you can see the very unnatural landform. This site is essentially a series of 2 peninsulas jutting out into the middle of the lake. That's often what we see. One of the bigger challenges that we have with our natural shorelines and working on trying to restore these within the Great Lakes is they often occur in very unnatural settings where fill has occurred or unnatural hardening. We have ships, we have barges. A lot of our shorelines no longer exist in a true natural environment. That presents a number of challenges from a design perspective. So here we are. This is the West Michigan Shoreline Regional Development Commission. Representative Kathy Evans on the left, and the landowner, Dennis Kirksey, on the right. And it's actually us out there during the winter, and you can see as ice is just starting to break up for the year. And that shows design challenge one with this project is once that ice starts to break up, those sheets can cause ice ridges and ice rills and really start to beat up a shoreline. Here are a few other pictures of that shoreline. Before we restored it, it was filled with basically nothing but large concrete slabs. Some of these were 1, 2, 3 foot thick, basically placed on the shoreline for historic erosion protection, which it was doing its job, but it totally disconnected the land from the water over time. More pictures in here. You can see a chunk of slag with ice breaking up around it. Some more pictures of what that shoreline looked like prior to restoration, just large chunks of concrete scattered all the way along it. So in this particular case, because we had such an unnatural landform, we weren't able to restore the shoreline without incorporating some sort of a hardened structure, in this case stone, into the restoration. The landowner wanted to make sure that the shoreline would stay intact in the long term. He was very risk intolerant in this particular case. And again, we also had a landform that was totally unnatural and filled. So the design that we came up with was to lower the overall elevation of these peninsulas in order to bring them closer to the water level, but still keeping them above the Great Lakes, the Lake Michigan high water level. Create a stone toe along the shoreline with different sizes of rocks. Closer to the shoreline, we were able to use smaller rock because the area was slightly more protected. As we got out toward the lakeward tip of the shoreline, we actually had to use some larger rock. Then we designed these angled cuts into the shoreline with scattered boulders. And what those cuts allowed us to do was to allow a connection between the land and the water by basically creating gaps through our rock toe. So these were constructed using pre-vegetated coconut pillows. That's a bioengineered product. They're about 2 to 3 inches thick, and they can be rolled out in a mat. In this case, they were pre-vegetated, but these can also be planted in place. And then if you look off to the left of the diagram, you can see kind of the end of the stone toe. What we did over these mats is we placed large boulders. We didn't need a totally continuous toe. So in this case, by using these larger rocks, we were able to break up the wave energy and the ice and roughen that shoreline while still providing a place for plants to get established and for wildlife to pass back and forth from the land to the water. So as I mentioned earlier, talking about Great Lakes water levels and these short and long-term water level fluctuations that we see, this site was designed back in 2010. If you see 2010, Lake Michigan is actually close to its historic low. And at that time, due to climate change, there were a lot of projections actually saying that the Great Lakes were never going to come up to even average water level again. So we had design choices to make. Do we design for a high water level event, which could occur? History said that would occur over time, even though the current projections in the face of climate change said that the water levels would continue to go down. In this case, because the landowner was savvy and also very risk averse, we made the decision to design against those high water levels and actually design the height of our stone toe against high water events. And lo and behold, what happened a couple of years after we constructed the project is within about a 2-year period, Lake Michigan jumped about 4 feet in height. It had never risen that quickly before, but it definitely made us glad that we designed against that event. So here are some before and after pictures. As you can see, during construction, because we were at low water, the shoreline manifested itself in what looked like essentially a big pile of rocks. But as those water levels came up, you can see in the picture below here that we still had our shoreline protection, but we had bulrush and willows and a number of other different native species able to establish themselves in those safe spaces, in those protected areas around those rocks. Again, here's just another picture, still having that gap across the land-water interface, and those rocks allowing the bulrush to get established. And then once that emergent wetland vegetation gets established, it's able to start to creep out onto the waterbed, or out onto the bed. So oftentimes, one of the most difficult challenges with projects like this is just getting the vegetation established in the first place. Once the vegetation gets established, it can often continue to sustain itself, but that establishment period is really, really difficult and challenging. And that's where oftentimes we need structures like rock in place. Just some other pictures. This is that high water event, again, making us very glad that we designed against it. As that lake came up, this site has held up incredibly well to higher lake levels. And here you can see the inner lakeward side of that peninsula where we actually did not need to use rock. So we actually, on this project, we used 3 different sizes of rock, and in some cases we were able to stabilize the shoreline utilizing only bioengineered materials and native plants. And in this picture you can also see a swallow flying just off to the left and an osprey platform that we installed out on the end of the peninsula. So the next project is a little bit different because it's not a coastal wetland project, but we thought that for the sake of this webinar that it might be pertinent to a lot of people working with shoreline restoration projects. And this is actually a project that we worked on for a private landowner who had a severely eroded dune bluff facing Lake Michigan. This project was funded entirely by the landowner, Mr. Kasparic. The private residence, he had just built his retirement home, and during the course of building his retirement home, he put in a nice new $200,000 set of stairs down his bluff. Well, lo and behold, those stairs completely destabilized the bluff and created a significant amount of erosion over time. So this project, we began assessing the site in 2005. We constructed it in 2007, and it was actually built at a cost that is in today's dollars incredibly cheap. $95,000 for this project. He got a heck of a steal because I believe that if this project were constructed today or with a different contractor, likely would have cost easily $500,000 or more. When this project came together, because we knew we were working with a private landowner, we had a local landscape contractor, our firm, and a local erosion control supplier, and we all put our heads together in kind of a bit of a design build it as we go type of project, working with Mr. Kasparic in order to try to come up with the best that we could within his budget. So here's what the project looked like prior to construction. You can see a pipe to the left that took a stormwater drain down off of his yard. And you can see those stairs, and you can see significant erosion occurring around the footings of a lot of those stairs, and rills and gullies formed all the way up and down. And one thing about this site in particular is not all of our dune bluffs are sand. And in this case, we had about 70 feet high of sand and then about a 10-foot thick clay lens, and that's very common through this part of Lake Michigan. And then what happens often in these areas is groundwater runs on top of that clay lens and then exits the surface on a dune bluff and oftentimes causes significant erosion. So here's some more pictures of what that looked like. You can see this kind of vertical face where the sand on top of that clay lens was being lost. One thing that we really had going for us here is that there were some places where the vegetation was still holding. And one of the things we try to do with natural shoreline restoration, any kind of bioengineering, is we try to see what nature is doing and what's working for nature. So on this severely eroded bluff, we actually had some plants that where they were established were actually holding very well. One of those plants was red osier dogwood, and you can see that over on the upper left of the picture. Believe it or not, red osier dogwood occurs both in emergent wetlands and on Lake Michigan dune bluffs and other dune bluffs across the Great Lakes. The other plant that we saw wherever it was present that was really holding its own was switchgrass, which is a prairie grass. You don't see too often on open dune bluffs, but because of that clay, it had become very well established. And wherever there was that dogwood and wherever there was that switchgrass, there wasn't erosion on this bluff. But pretty much every place else on the bluff, there was significant erosion, and the stairs were starting to bend and buckle, and he was losing a couple of feet a year off of his shoreline. So the design solution that we came up with was to anchor GeoWeb at the upper part of the slope. And that was to stabilize that area up above that clay lens where the groundwater had continued to flow out of the shoreline. In addition to that, we put an underdrain in order to intercept that groundwater the best that we could in order to help keep that water from interacting with the surface at all. From there, we created a tiered stacked straw wattle system all the way up and down the shoreline, which was then densely planted with switchgrass, little blue stem, willows, and dogwoods. And again, those of us or those of you that work in wetland systems might say, well, gosh, willows and dogwoods, what are they doing on a Lake Michigan bluff? But believe it or not, those species actually do occur on some of these high and dry Lake Michigan bluffs, in part because they've evolved to be there, and in part because those groundwater flows can often be so significant that those plants are able to establish. So here's what this project looked like. And I apologize for the poor quality. Digital camera quality wasn't, back in 2007, wasn't what it is right now. And here's what the project looked like 1 year after construction. You can see that vegetation starting to grow in. The straw wattles are still in place, but all of the seeding and the live plantings that were put in place are really starting to take hold. Again, here's just another shot before, during, and after of that project. We used North American Green SC250 blanket, which has a permanent weave on it in order to secure the vegetation that was established. And then here are some pictures. I actually stopped by the site last fall, just about this time, to take a look at it. So it's been about 8 or 9 years later, and I stopped in, and lo and behold, Mr. Kasparic was there. I hadn't talked to him in several years. And he said, oh my gosh, you saved our bluff, you saved our pool. And he was more than happy to walk the shoreline with me and talk to me about how it had developed over time. So here are a couple of pictures that you can see. The upper left, a vertically eroded face, and on the right, those willows have become very well established with switchgrass and little blue stems scattered all throughout. Here's a picture of that bluff. You can see on the left one of the pylons for the stairway, and that bluff again is totally vegetated at this point. Same view, upper left prior to construction, upper right during construction or just after construction, and then down below the picture that I took last year. And here's a view from the lake looking up at that bluff. So it's become totally vegetated. I didn't see any signs of anything slipping or eroding at this point. Very well stable and doing what it's supposed to do. The last project that I'm going to show is one that was completed for the city of Marysville. The city of Marysville is located on one of the connecting waters, the St. Clair River. This project partners included the EPA, who funded it This was one of the first projects funded through the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, and the City of Marysville were the primary partners, as well as the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality and Michigan Department of Natural Resources. So this project, similar to what Jen had described, very much dual purpose. As many of you working with shorelines know, waterfront property is incredibly valuable, both from a tourist standpoint, a public use standpoint, as well as a pure real estate standpoint. So you oftentimes see with a lot of these projects conflicting goals and conflicting desired outcomes. But what happens in a lot of cases is lately through funding sources such as the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, we oftentimes have funding available for ecological restoration. And in this case, the City of Marysville had about a 2,000 foot long failing seawall that was really the main central feature of the city's shoreline. The City of Marysville is built up around its shoreline. The public uses shoreline all the time. It was a major tourist attraction, major area for public use. But this seawall was failing in such a way that they had to close it down. But unfortunately, or fortunately for those of us on this call, there aren't too many grants out there funding seawall replacement anymore. But there are grants that fund shoreline restoration. So the City of Marysville was able to get a grant to restore their shoreline to a usable state again, but it needed to be in the context of ecological restoration. So this project consisted of removing approximately 1,900 linear feet of that seawall and restoring that shoreline at a total construction cost of $1.6 million, or about $800 a linear foot. But a lot of that was related specifically to that seawall removal. So to give you a pre-construction tour here, here's what some of that shoreline looked like. They had placed some pea stone along the way. The seawall had buckled in part through ice and in part just through time and historic construction design flaws. So they had started to lose their sidewalk, and they were doing things like trying to fill it in with stone and things like that just to make it usable for the public, but at the end of the day, it was a losing battle for the city. Again, this is, unfortunately, I'm sure many of you are looking at this and kind of nodding and smiling and saying, yeah, that's what your shorelines look like, whether you're in Chicago, Milwaukee, Buffalo, or Long Island. This is a very common sight throughout the Great Lakes. So when we're dealing with these Great Lakes connecting waters, they have some different unique challenges because they rise and fall along with the Great Lakes. So we get both short-term and long-term water level fluctuations, which can create significant design challenges. And at the same time, they can act a little bit like a lake and a little bit like a river. So we have wave forces to deal with from boats and barges and things like that. But then we also have shear stresses to deal with because they are riverine systems and there's flowing water moving past a shoreline. There are also historically major shipping lanes, which means that we don't just get small recreational boats coming through here. We get the big guys coming through with a fair amount of regularity and putting physical forces and waves on our shorelines. Then we also get significant ice flows to the point that the Coast Guard actually runs cutters through many of our connecting waters regularly in order to keep them open for the purposes of navigation. So going back to, again, on this project, these water level fluctuations for Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, when this project was designed, the water level was at about 576. It was about 577. When it was constructed, it was down at 576. And right now, the water level is up around 580. So again, that demonstrates the need to make sure that we're looking both short-term and long-term and not be fooled by current conditions anytime we're working on a shoreline restoration project within the Great Lakes. So again, this project had multiple goals. It was not a pure ecological restoration project, just like many of them aren't, just like Jen's project wasn't. We needed to make sure that we maintained public access to the water, at least in part, throughout some of the shoreline. People needed to be able to get out to the water to access the shoreline, to be able to fish, and to be able to recreate both passively and actively. So one of the first things one of the things that we wound up doing is actually designing in an elevated boardwalk that extended out over the lake or the river in order to allow public access to that water body. But in order to build some habitat into that, you can see in our diagram below, we snuck some large woody debris in there. So even though we have an elevated boardwalk, we were still able to create some habitat. Another view, this view is looking downstream or south. On the left, you can see that seawall and concrete system. On the right, we built a small retaining wall to take some of the elevation out along the road, poured a new concrete sidewalk, and then planted native prairie plantings in amongst those trees. So we put in prairie plantings and trees, all native species along the shoreline, and then you can see a rock toe down at the bottom here. And there's what that started to look like once it got established. You can see all of those native wildflowers starting to grow in. One of the other things that we did is we built kind of a pseudo, I'll call it a pseudo sill. Many of you may have seen a lot of the work that's been done in the Chesapeake Bay, where they build sills in order to protect some backwater wetlands. So in this case, we have an outer sill that you can see on the riverward side of the shoreline. We used pre-vegetated coconut pillows right behind that, and then we had a bit of a rock toe back behind those pre-vegetated coconut pillows. And again, going back to those water level fluctuations, the outer toe gives us protection during the low water events, and that upper toe gives us protection during high water events. And I'll show you in just a second here that in action. Going back, here's that lower toe, and again, going back to this idea that native emergent wetland vegetation in higher energy systems often needs safe spots in order to be able to establish. So in this case, we needed that rock, we needed that little bit of protection in order to help those guys get established. Once they get established, they'll start to creep out in and amongst and riverward of a lot of that armored protection, but without that armored protection, those new plants or these new seedings are just not able to get established. And again, here you can see one added element that we put in there was a root wad for additional habitat. There's kind of an old saying that there's more life in dead wood than there is in living wood, and incorporating wood through the use of logs or brush or root wads creates an incredible amount of habitat, because what you're really doing is you're feeding the whole base of the food chain. These root wads provide places for insects and macroinvertebrates to become established, which then provides something for birds and amphibians and fish to come up and feed on. So wood can provide food cover and shelter, as well as erosion protection for a lot of our native species. Here's this project 1 year after construction. So it was constructed in 2011. You can see the vegetation starting to become established. Again, we had a low water event, so you might scratch your head a little bit and say, well, is this really a shoreline restoration? We have a couple of big piles of rock out there. But what you see as we go from low water events to high water events is that lower rock toe, rock barrier has become completely submerged, and that upper rock barrier at that point gives us the protection that we need in order to maintain the integrity of our shoreline. But at the same time, we now have completely established emergent wetland vegetation, which is going to continue to creep out onto the river bottom and provide that habitat over time. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Emily and I guess open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Brian. Let's see. Again, we will be taking questions from the audience via chat, or some people use the Q&A. You can use that as well. I'm just wondering if you go back, Brian, to the slide just before for a second.
Sure. And you have the ball now, so you might have to flip back.
Oh, okay. Well, you gave it to Emily. All right. 1 second. Okay, this slide. In this slide,
sure.
How far out would that seawall have been in this slide, in this picture?
Sure. So on this side, the seawall was right about where that upper rock toe is.
Mm-hmm.
So just on the landward side of the bulrushes and the emergent wetland vegetation, pretty much right where the water line is.
Right. So were any community members disappointed in not having that, like lacking that sidewalk space that they had before?
Yes. This project, we went through many design iterations. And going back to that kind of tension that can come from having a project funded for the purposes of ecological restoration, but also having the goal of providing public access to the water, those two don't always line up very neatly. Mm-hmm. So we needed to come up with a design solution that the granting agency, in this case the EPA, would approve as being a natural and living shoreline, but that by the same time would be acceptable for the city of Marysville, and do it all within their construction budget. So we went through many design iterations, many different city council meetings, and at the end of the day, all parties had to make sacrifices, which meant that in some cases we were able to establish a shoreline like this, and in other cases we built that elevated boardwalk out over the water to still allow some public access to the water.
Oh, all right. Okay.
Brian, I wanted to know how is that boardwalk doing winter and summer? And I assume it's a permanent boardwalk. So is it holding up well to the ice and other physical forces?
It is, and if you wanted to flip back to the design cross-section real quick, it is holding up well. We put fairly deep footings in, which was a part of the project, making sure that we handled the geotechnical investigation side of the project properly. And you can actually see there that the footings of that boardwalk are actually steel pilings filled with concrete. So it's a pretty significant footing that we put that elevated boardwalk on in order to be able to handle the ice pressure over time.
And you chose the level at the 100-year floodplain?
That's correct. So again, sometimes we have these difficult design decisions to make, and sometimes it would have probably been safer to raise it up a little bit higher than that. But in this case, we felt fairly confident that this structure would be able to hold up okay at the 100-year mark.
Thank you.
All right. We do have more questions. Let me start off with this one from, oh, there's a whole bunch. Let's see. Okay, this one from Joshua Unger. How well did the prairie cord grass establish after the first 2 years?
So I believe that Jen's was the prairie cordgrass project.
Oh, okay, sorry. So that must have been a question for before.
But we can ask Jen to answer it.
Jen, do you want to answer that question?
Sure, can you repeat it for me?
How well did the prairie cordgrass establish after the first 2 years?
The patches that didn't get mowed established decently. The patches that got mowed after initial planting are almost completely gone.
Okay, that's really unfortunate. Darn mowers. All right, Denise Harrington asks, what were the design slopes on the latter 2 projects? What kind of equipment was used? I'm pretty sure this is for Brian.
Sure. On the Bluff project, and that's actually a pretty important point that I left out or I neglected to mention. On the Bluff project, people with lakefront property often build houses fairly close to each other. So we only had about an 8-foot wide gap through a fence in order to get out to that bluff. So that Bluff project was built almost entirely by hand. Believe it or not. It took a crew of 8 guys about 2 months out there working on that project, but it was built almost entirely by hand and just a small mini excavator. And that bluff still wound up being about a 1-on-1 slope. For the work in Marysville, we had varied slopes depending on what the shoreline did. We had a public roadway that was right next to it. So we were able to vary the slope between a 3-on-1 and about a 5-on-1, depending on where we were at on the shoreline. And in order to take up some of that slope, we did put a little bit of a retaining wall in a few spots, which allowed us to make the slope at the water's edge gentler.
Okay. Let's see. There's a question from Brian Hinterberger. I like that in your first example, you talked about lake levels as a major source of risk to be assessed and mitigated. Could you describe other examples of how risk assessment influence design decisions, like storm surges, wave run-up, and flood event recurrence intervals? How do you integrate risk management and communication into the design process?
That's a fantastic question. And for anybody that works with natural shoreline restoration and bioengineering, I'm sure you understand that there's a constant tension between making a shoreline soft and making a shoreline structurally sound to make sure that it'll stand up over time. Structural and traditional engineering practice will typically engineer a site and then put a safety factor of about 2 on it, and then you wind up with sites that oftentimes lose any kind of ecological benefit. But by the same accord, if you don't account for some level of risk management and you focus too much on the biological side of things, then you can have a shoreline that becomes blown out, eroded, or damaged in a lot of different ways. So anytime we're working on a design project, we try to be very upfront and transparent about the risk associated with any of these projects with the combination of the landowner and the funding agency. Everyone has a little bit different goals and everyone has a little bit different risk tolerances. So we try to make that a very open and transparent part of the discussion. And what we found over time is that when you combine those goals of shoreline integrity, ecological benefits, and then budgets, you can usually find some sort of middle ground. But with that being said, it's never perfect. And what we often find is that if somebody wants to err on the side of ecological functions and perhaps less on the functional values, or on the structural values, and they're willing to take on a little bit more risk, then we typically make sure that those maintenance plans are much more robust in that they even potentially set aside funding as a part of a project in order to go back and do those repairs, because inevitably if you err too much on the soft side of a project, some sort of a repair is going to be needed over time. So, but there's tension, it's very imperfect, And this is a realm that traditional engineers get very queasy working in, because guarantees and warranties are very difficult to do when we're working with nature-based systems.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. So another question, Nancy Stoner asked, how did you anchor the root wads in?
In this case, the root wads were anchored with a stone toe. So we placed the root wads in place and then put a stone over the top of it. And the weight of the stone was enough to hold it down.
Oh, right. I remember in the including the pillows in the first.
So you don't have to drive stakes in or anything like that. It's just weighted by the stone.
Yeah, in this case, it's just weighted by the stone. In other cases where we're using less stone, we might drive it in with stakes or cabling and duckbill anchors. Every project winds up being a little bit different. But in this case, we had enough stone on that toe that the stone was sufficient to hold it in place.
All right. Joshua Unger asked, what species were used for root wads? What size?
I wish I could tell you off the top of my head which species we used. We usually try to use harder woods, such as sugar maple or red oaks. Or red pines actually tend to hold up really, really well as woody structures because they have a very thick sap that seems to really shed water and allows them to hold up and have quite a bit of longevity over time. The sizes of the root wads here, the roots were in the range of 4 to 5 foot diameter.
Okay, thank you.
There was a question about the threat of invasive species. Is that part of the maintenance plan? I mean, the question was, you know, how do you deal with invasive species?
And invasive species, and I'm sure Jen would probably echo the same sentiment. They're always an issue on these projects, and unfortunately, they're always going to be an issue on these projects. Sometimes the trouble is that grant funding mechanisms don't always fund long-term maintenance of invasive plant species. So what we do when we can, and in this case, in the case of the Marysville project and the Muskegon Lake project, we wrote management plans to go along with the designs. And then we worked with the landowners at each of those locations, including the individual landowners, the city public works departments, and local volunteer bases. We actually put on workshops to teach the communities and landowners how to maintain these sites in the long term, just knowing that it would be inevitable that invasive species would come along.
All right, okay, thank you very much, Brian. And thank you for all of your questions, audience members. We would like to conclude this webinar. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for joining us in the live audience. All right, so thank you, Jennifer Dunn. Thank you, Brian Micah. Thanks, Emily Hauser. Do you have anything to say?
I want to thank everyone for attending. We will try to bring Tim DePriest back probably in January, if that works for him. And I think Sarah will tell you that we do record this, and we will also put the presentations up on our website. And Sarah will remind you that when you leave the webinar.
Yes, as you're leaving the webinar, a survey will pop up, and we'd like you to fill out the survey so we know how we did and if you learned anything. Remember to send your attendee list to me at the email address above that little cloud, if you can see it, and look out for our presentations and recording of the presentations, which will be up on our website under the Estuary Training Program tab next week. And so you can share that with any of your colleagues that were not able to attend today.
Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot.
So we're going to sign off now. Thank you again for attending.
All right, have a great day.
You too.
Thank you.
I have to tell it to stop recording or it just stops. Yeah. Oh. Yeah, we can hang up.